What if everything you learned about World War I missed the most important part of the story? Most people think it started when an Austrian archduke got shot in Sarajevo, but that's like saying the Titanic sank because it hit ice. Sure, that's what happened on the surface, but what if the real cause was something completely different? A financial crisis that had already bankrupted Europe's great powers decades before anyone fired a shot. What if I told you that Europe's great powers had already bankrupted themselves decades before the first shot was fired? What if the assassination was just the excuse they needed to solve a financial crisis that threatened to destroy their empires? Let me show you how mounting debts turned political rivalries into financial necessities, and how the greatest military conflict in human history was actually the world's most expensive debt consolidation program. The story begins in the 1850s, when European powers discovered something that would change the world forever. You could borrow money to build an empire faster than you could earn it through conquest. Britain led the charge, using massive loans to expand railways across India, build naval bases across 6 continents, and maintain the largest military force the world had ever seen. The system worked brilliantly, as long as the empire kept growing and generating new revenue streams. But here's where the math gets dangerous. By 1914, Britain's national debt had ballooned to £650 million, an astronomical sum that required careful management of interest payments and constant refinancing. France, Germany, and Russia followed the same playbook, each borrowing heavily to fund their own imperial ambitions. They thought they were playing a game of territorial expansion. They were actually playing a game of compound interest. Think about your own mortgage for a moment. You probably calculated your monthly payments carefully, made sure you could handle the interest rate, and maybe even got pre-approved before house hunting. Now imagine if your neighbor was also buying houses, and your other neighbor was buying even bigger houses, and suddenly you felt pressure to buy more houses just to keep up. That's essentially what happened to Europe's great powers, except instead of houses, they were buying battleships, armies, and entire continents. Germany provides the most dramatic example of this imperial debt spiral. Under Kaiser Wilhelm, German borrowing exploded as the nation tried to challenge British naval supremacy, while simultaneously building railways across Africa and establishing colonies in the Pacific. The German government convinced itself that each new territorial acquisition would pay for itself through resource extraction and trade revenues. Sound familiar? It's the same logic that fueled our housing bubble in 2008, the belief that rising asset values would always cover rising debt payments. But the real shock comes when you look at the Ottoman Empire, which serves as a preview of what happens when imperial debt gets out of control. In 1875, the Ottoman government declared bankruptcy with debts totaling £200 million. Here's the kicker: their annual debt payments exceeded half of their national revenue. European creditors didn't just write off the loss. They established the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, which gave foreign bondholders direct control over Turkish tax collection and government spending. Think about that for a second. A sovereign nation, controlling territory across 3 continents, essentially became a subsidiary of European banks. Ottoman sultans could still wear their ceremonial robes and hold their fancy titles, but real financial decisions got made in London, Paris, and Berlin. This wasn't just debt restructuring, this was the template for modern financial colonialism. The Declaration of London in 1914 made this dangerous game official, formally recognizing credit as an essential element of the Anglo-French-Russian alliance. Military partnerships were now explicitly tied to financial partnerships. When you signed up as an ally, you weren't just agreeing to fight together, you were agreeing to borrow together, guaranteeing each other's debts and sharing the financial risks of imperial competition. By 1914, every major European power was trapped in the same impossible situation. They owed massive debts that required constant territorial expansion to service, but territorial expansion required even more borrowing, which created even larger debts. The system had become mathematically unstable. Something had to give. Either these empires would find a way to dramatically increase their revenues, or they would face financial collapse. War, it turned out, offered both a solution and an excuse. Military victory would mean access to enemy territories and resources, potentially solving the revenue problem. Military necessity would justify levels of government borrowing that would be politically impossible during peacetime. And most importantly, war would allow governments to restructure their entire financial relationships with both their own citizens and their international creditors. Those European emperors weren't expanding empires. They were expanding liabilities that would eventually consume everything they claimed to protect. Here's where the story gets really interesting, because by 1916, something unprecedented was happening in global finance. Britain wasn't just funding its own war. It was funding most of the empire's expenses, all of Italy's war costs, and two-thirds of what France and Russia were spending on their military operations. Think about that for a moment. One country was essentially paying for a world war involving dozens of nations. How does that even work financially? The answer lies in a web of international banking relationships that most people have never heard about, but which determined the fate of millions. When you understand how these financial arrangements actually worked, the entire war starts to look less like a political conflict and more like a massive debt collection operation with armies instead of repo men. Let's start with a question that should grab our attention. Why was J.P. Morgan Jr., an American banker, organizing military supply contracts for European armies 2 years before America even entered the war? In 1915, Morgan put together a syndicate of 2,200 American banks to float a $500 million loan to the Allied powers. But here's the kicker. This wasn't just a loan. Every single British munitions purchase had to go through Morgan firms, giving American bankers direct control over European military procurement. Pop quiz: when a foreign bank controls your military supply chain, are you still a sovereign nation, or have you become something else entirely? Britain, the empire that ruled a quarter of the world's landmass, had essentially outsourced its war finance to Wall Street. The lion was borrowing money from the eagle to buy bullets. But the really wild part is what happened to interest rates during this period. As European governments borrowed more and more money to fund their military operations, the cost of borrowing kept climbing. Higher interest rates meant that territorial expansion wasn't just politically desirable, it was mathematically necessary. You needed new revenue streams just to service your existing debt, let alone fund new military campaigns. France and Russia found themselves in an especially dangerous position. Their gold reserves, which had been dwarfing those of the Bank of England, according to financial records from the period, became crucial leverage in alliance negotiations. When you're negotiating military alliances, you're not just promising to fight together. You're promising to share the financial burden of keeping each other's governments solvent. Here's where it gets almost surreal. Germany's Reichsbank was providing short-term credit to the government while war loans consolidated long-term debt, creating what financial historians now recognize as an early version of debt monetization. The German government was essentially printing money to pay interest on money it had already borrowed to fund military operations that were supposed to generate enough plunder to pay back the original loans. Does this sound familiar? It's the same cycle that led to our 2008 financial crisis. Except instead of mortgage-backed securities, European powers were betting on victory-backed securities. Each new military campaign was supposed to pay for itself through territorial conquest, resource extraction, and reparation payments from defeated enemies. The Bank of England, Rothschilds, Barings, Morgans, Kleinworts, and Schroders, London's 5 great merchant banks, dominated international investment ventures and had enormous financial stakes in the outcome of European conflicts. These weren't neutral observers providing banking services. They were active participants whose bond portfolios depended on specific military outcomes. Let me put this in perspective with a modern example. Imagine if Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Bank of America had each loaned billions of dollars to different sides in a regional conflict, with the loan terms depending on who won the war. Now imagine that these banks also controlled the weapons suppliers for each side. Do you think those banks would remain neutral, or would they have strong incentives to influence the outcome? That's exactly what happened in Europe between 1914 and 1918. International lending had created mutual dependencies where creditor nations had vested interests in their debtors' military success. When Britain loaned money to France and Russia, British banks weren't just hoping for loan repayment, they were betting on Allied victory. When German banks financed Austrian military operations, they were making the same kind of bet on Central Powers' success. The result was a financial system where military defeat meant not just political humiliation, but complete economic collapse. Losing the war meant defaulting on international loans, losing access to global credit markets, and facing the kind of foreign financial control that had already happened to the Ottoman Empire. By 1916, credit restrictions and rising interest rates had made territorial expansion the only viable strategy for avoiding bankruptcy. European powers weren't fighting for glory or nationalism or even strategic advantage. They were fighting to avoid the financial equivalent of foreclosure. The war had become a massive game of musical chairs, where whoever stopped fighting first would face complete economic devastation. This is why the conflict escalated so quickly and became so brutally total. It wasn't enough to win a few battles or negotiate a favorable peace treaty. Each side needed complete victory to generate enough plunder and reparations to pay back their international creditors. Anything less than total victory meant financial ruin that would last for generations. The human cost of this financial logic was staggering, but the banking system had created incentives that made peace more dangerous than war for heavily indebted governments. When your national survival depends on borrowed money, and your ability to borrow depends on winning military conflicts, you don't have the luxury of choosing peace. Now we get to the part of the story that completely changes how you understand America's role in World War I. You've probably heard that the United States tried to stay neutral until German submarines forced our hand. That's the official version. The real version involves a man named J.P. Morgan Jr. and the largest financial gamble in human history. Picture Morgan in his Wall Street office in 1915, surrounded by maps of Europe covered in red pins marking battlefields where American money was financing the slaughter. By this point, Morgan had organized loans totaling $1.5 billion to the Allied powers. That's roughly $35 billion in today's money. But here's what makes this absolutely wild. Morgan wasn't just lending money. He was essentially running Britain's entire military procurement operation from Manhattan. Every British munitions purchase, every French artillery order, every Russian rifle contract had to go through Morgan firms. The man who controlled Allied weapons supplies was an American banker whose profits depended on keeping the war going long enough for the Allies to win decisively. Think about the conflict of interest here. Morgan had every financial incentive to prevent peace negotiations that might end the war before the Allies could generate enough plunder to pay back their American loans. But Morgan was just the beginning. By 1917, the situation had escalated far beyond private banking. The United States Treasury was extending massive loans directly to European governments, with America lending more than $10 billion to foreign nations, an astronomical sum that transformed the global financial system overnight. The United States went from being a net international debtor of $3.2 billion in 1914 to becoming the world's largest creditor nation by 1918. Here's where the timing gets suspicious. The Federal Reserve, America's central banking system, was created in 1913, just 1 year before the war started. Coincidence? The Fed provided the institutional framework that made massive war debt monetization possible. Without the Federal Reserve's ability to expand the money supply and coordinate with private banks, the scale of American lending to Europe would have been financially impossible. Let's talk about what this meant in practical terms. American entry into the war wasn't just about submarines or diplomatic tensions. By 1917, American banks and the U.S. government had loaned so much money to the Allied powers that an Allied defeat would have triggered the largest financial crisis in American history. Morgan and his associates weren't just hoping for Allied victory. They desperately needed it to avoid bankruptcy. Think about this scenario. You've loaned your life savings to a friend who's in a fight with someone else. If your friend loses the fight, you never see your money again. If your friend wins, you get your money back with interest. Are you going to stay neutral in that fight, or are you going to do everything possible to help your friend win? That's exactly the position America found itself in by 1917. The transformation was remarkable. In just 3 years, the United States went from neutral observer to active participant, not because of political ideology or military strategy, but because of financial exposure. American entry transformed inter-allied credits from a hybrid public-private network into direct government-to-government lending relationships, with the United States as the ultimate global creditor. But here's the part that should really grab our attention. While European powers were bleeding themselves to death in trenches, American industrial capacity was exploding. Massive Allied purchases of American weapons, food, and raw materials reversed our international debt position and established the foundation for American economic dominance that would last for the next century. Morgan and his associates had essentially figured out how to profit from European self-destruction. They weren't funding a war. They were funding the transfer of global economic power from European empires to American financial institutions. Every artillery shell fired in France, every tank rolling across Belgian fields, every battleship sunk in the Atlantic represented loan payments flowing from European treasuries to American banks. The human drama here is staggering. European soldiers were dying in trenches to protect bond portfolios held by American financiers who had never seen a battlefield. Young men from British farms and German villages were killing each other to determine whether Morgan's loans would be repaid in pounds sterling or whether they would default entirely. By the time America officially entered the war in 1917, our participation was essentially inevitable. We weren't choosing sides based on democratic values or humanitarian concerns. We were protecting a financial investment that had grown too large to fail. American doughboys shipped to European battlefields weren't fighting for freedom or democracy. They were fighting to collect on debts that European powers owed to American banks. The scale of this financial manipulation becomes clear when you look at the numbers. Between Morgan's private syndicate and direct treasury lending, American financial institutions controlled the outcome of the world's largest military conflict. European empires that had dominated global affairs for centuries found themselves financially dependent on a nation that most of them had considered a former colony just a few decades earlier. This wasn't accidental. The same financial institutions that had created boom and bust cycles in American railroad construction and industrial development had simply scaled up their operations to include entire continents. They had figured out how to monetize international conflict on a scale that previous generations could never have imagined. The real genius of the American position was that we profited regardless of how long the war lasted or how many people died. Longer conflicts meant more loan interest, more weapons sales, and more opportunities to establish financial dominance over European competitors. American banks had discovered the perfect business model, lending money to both sides of every conflict, while controlling the supply chains that determined military outcomes. Now, we reach the moment when the entire financial house of cards becomes visible, and you'll understand why the war to end all wars actually established the permanent debt-based international system we're still living under today. What happened after the armistice wasn't peace. It was the largest debt restructuring operation in human history, disguised as treaty negotiations. Here's the shocking reality. By 1919, the United Kingdom's national debt had exploded from £706 million in 1914 to £7,481 million by the war's end. That's more than 10 times the original amount. France, Russia, and Germany faced similar debt explosions that made normal peacetime governance financially impossible. These weren't just big numbers. They represented obligations that would consume national budgets for generations. But the real revelation comes when you follow the money flow after Versailles. Germany was required to pay massive reparations to Britain and France, but here's the twist. Germany financed those reparation payments with loans from American banks. Britain and France then used German reparation money to pay their debts to the United States. The entire system was a circular debt arrangement, where American banks were essentially lending Germany money to pay reparations that would flow back to American creditors. Let me walk you through this financial shell game step by step. Between 1919 and 1932, Germany paid 19 billion gold marks in reparations to the Allied powers. During the same period, Germany received 27 billion gold marks in loans from American banks. Germany was borrowing more money than it was paying out, but the reparation payments created a legal framework for permanent financial supervision of German domestic policy. Think about what this means. The Treaty of Versailles wasn't really a peace agreement. It was a debt collection mechanism that established American financial institutions as the ultimate arbiters of European economic policy. German reparations, British war debt payments, and French Reconstruction loans all flowed through the same American banking networks that had financed the original conflict. The human cost of this arrangement was staggering, but it gets worse when you realize that European governments understood exactly what they were signing. According to financial records from the period, European sovereigns had borrowed during the war, assuming they were defending civilization. But they discovered that Americans treated international lending as business investment aimed at maximizing profit rather than supporting allied nations. This created a fundamental mismatch in expectations that would define international relations for the next century. European powers expected debt forgiveness or favorable restructuring based on shared sacrifice and common values. American creditors expected full repayment with interest based on standard commercial terms. When those expectations collided, the result was economic policies that prioritized debt service over human welfare. The scale of this financial control becomes clear when you look at how long these obligations lasted. The final installment of German World War I debt wasn't paid until October 3, 2010. Read that again, 2010. Germany spent 92 years paying for a war that lasted 4 years. British war debt payments to the United States continued until 2006. France didn't finish paying its World War I obligations until 2009. This means that people who were born decades after the armistice spent their entire working lives paying taxes to service debts incurred by governments that had ceased to exist before their grandparents were born. The war had ended, But the financial obligations created a permanent system of international wealth transfer that operated regardless of changing political circumstances. But here's the part that should really make our blood boil. While ordinary Europeans spent the next century paying for this financial arrangement, the banking institutions that created the debt spiral became more powerful and profitable than ever. World War I established the template for modern sovereign debt crises, where military conflicts serve as opportunities for financial institutions to establish permanent revenue streams through government indebtedness. The pattern repeats throughout the 20th century and continues today. International conflicts create emergency borrowing situations that allow financial institutions to establish long-term control over national economic policies. Debt service requirements then shape domestic priorities for generations, regardless of democratic preferences or changing political leadership. When you understand this system, current events start to make more sense. Why do sovereign debt crises always seem to result in austerity policies that benefit international creditors while imposing costs on ordinary citizens? Why do military conflicts consistently lead to increased government indebtedness rather than decreased international tensions? Why do peace negotiations always involve complex financial arrangements that seem to matter more than territorial or political agreements? The answer is that World War I established a precedent where international conflicts serve primarily as debt consolidation exercises rather than political or territorial disputes. Modern wars aren't fought to resolve international disagreements. They're fought to create financial obligations that generate permanent revenue streams for international creditors. Those European emperors we started with, gathering in ornate palaces with fountain pens poised over important documents, they weren't signing treaties expanding their empires. They were signing loan agreements that would eventually bankrupt their nations and establish a global financial system where human welfare became subordinate to debt service requirements. The war to end all wars didn't end war. It made war financially profitable on a permanent basis. Every international conflict since 1918 has followed the same basic pattern. Emergency borrowing creates long-term financial obligations that outlast the original political disputes by decades. We're not living in a world shaped by the outcomes of historical conflicts. We're living in a world shaped by the financial arrangements that funded those conflicts. And that, more than any assassination or alliance system or imperial rivalry, explains why our current international system prioritizes financial stability over human security, debt service over democratic governance, and creditor rights over national sovereignty. The bankers won World War I, and we're all still paying for their victory.